The São Miguel made landfall at Salvador da Bahia on a humid morning in June 1502. The city was barely 2 years old, a collection of crude wooden structures and a single stone church overlooking the bay. Portuguese colonists had carved this settlement from the coastal forest with ambition that far exceeded their numbers. They needed labor, massive amounts of it, to harvest the Brazil wood that gave the colony its name, to plant the first experimental sugarcane fields, to build the infrastructure of empire. Kwame and the other survivors were marched from the ship in chains, their legs weak from months of immobility. The Brazilian sun hit him like a physical force, so bright after the darkness of the hold that he had to squeeze his eyes shut. When he opened them, he saw a crowd of colonists gathered at the dock, Portuguese merchants, a few African freedmen who worked as translators, and several Jesuit priests in black robes who watched the proceedings with expressions that might have been sympathy or might have been curiosity. Father Antonio Cardoso, the youngest of the Jesuits, felt his stomach turn as the captives shuffled past. He had arrived from Coimbra only 3 months earlier, full of missionary zeal and the sincere belief that he could save souls in this new world. But nothing in his theological training had prepared him for the reality of the slave trade. These people, some of them barely alive, were to be baptized, given Christian names, and put to work in conditions that seemed designed to kill them slowly. The auction took place in the town square, a clearing of packed earth surrounded by palm trees. A Portuguese merchant named Sebastião Ferreira conducted the proceedings with the efficiency of a man selling livestock. He examined teeth, felt muscle tone, made the captives jump or squat to demonstrate their fitness. Those too sick or injured to perform these acts were sold at discount, a calculated risk for buyers hoping they might recover with food and rest. Kwame was purchased by a man named Dom Pedro Alvarez, who owned a sugar plantation 15 miles inland along the Paraguaçu River. Dom Pedro was a minor nobleman from Porto who had come to Brazil to rebuild a fortune squandered by his father's gambling debts. He bought 12 captives that day, 8 men and 4 women, paying 60 ducats for Kwame, based on the strength visible in his shoulders and arms, despite his emaciated state. The plantation was a sprawling operation carved from dense Atlantic forest. The main house stood on a rise overlooking fields of sugarcane that stretched toward a river the color of rust. Slave quarters consisted of a long wooden shed divided into small cells, each housing 4 to 6 people on dirt floors with no furniture beyond a few straw mats. There was a well, but the enslaved were forbidden from using it without supervision. Instead, water was distributed twice daily by an overseer named Tomás, a brutal man from Lisbon who had lost 3 fingers on his left hand in a machete accident and seemed to blame every enslaved person on the property for that loss. While the enslaved were denied regular access to water, the plantation owners, on the other hand, maintained meticulous personal hygiene. Dom Pedro bathed daily in water heated by enslaved workers and scented with imported lavender. His wife, Dona Isabel, had a copper bathtub shipped from Portugal at enormous expense. The couple's 3 children were scrubbed clean every evening by an enslaved woman named Maria, who was not permitted to wash her own children with the same frequency or care. Kwame was assigned to the cane fields, work that began before sunrise and continued until darkness made it impossible to see. The stalks grew 12 feet high, their leaves sharp enough to cut exposed skin. Harvesting required swinging a machete for hours, bending, cutting, stripping leaves, bundling stalks. The heat was suffocating. Sweat poured from his body, mixing with the dust from the dry season and the sticky residue of cane juice. By midday, every worker was caked in a layer of grime that attracted flies and mosquitoes in swarms. Water breaks were brief and irregular. Thomas would bring a barrel on a cart, but he rationed it based on productivity. Those who cut the most cane received full ladles. Those who fell behind, whether from exhaustion, injury, or illness, received less or nothing at all. Washing was forbidden during work hours. At night, when the enslaved returned to their quarters, they were sometimes allowed to rinse their hands and faces from a communal bucket, but never their bodies. Full baths were prohibited without explicit permission from Dom Pedro, and such permission was rarely granted. Father Antonio visited the plantation once a week to conduct mass and hear confessions. He quickly realized that Dom Pedro's prohibitions on bathing were not merely practical considerations about water usage, they were instruments of control. When he tentatively suggested that allowing the enslaved to wash more frequently might reduce the spread of disease and improve productivity, Dom Pedro laughed. "You are a priest, father, not a plantation manager," Dom Pedro said, sipping wine on the veranda as the sun set over his fields. "These people are not like us. They come from jungle villages where they lived like animals. Cleanliness is not natural to them. If we allow them to waste time bathing, they will become lazy and defiant. Keep them dirty, keep them humble, and they will remember their place." But Father Antonio saw what Dom Pedro chose to ignore. In the slave quarters, skin diseases spread rapidly. Fungal infections bloomed in the folds of unwashed flesh. Open cuts from machete accidents or whiplashes became infected, turning putrid with pus. Several enslaved people developed respiratory illnesses from sleeping in clothes soaked with sweat and never properly dried or cleaned. 2 children died from fever in their first month on the plantation, their small bodies wrapped in dirty cloth and buried without ceremony in an unmarked corner of the property. Kwame learned the rules through pain and observation. He watched as a woman named Adisa was caught washing her legs in the river during a brief rest period. Tomas dragged her back to the quarters and whipped her in front of everyone, 15 lashes that opened her back in stripes of red. The message was explicit. Your body is not yours to clean. We decide when you are permitted dignity. Nights in the quarters were suffocating. The air hung heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, infection, and despair. Kwame lay on his straw mat, skin itching from dried sweat and insect bites, and thought about the ocean. Not the hellish Middle Passage, but the ocean of his childhood, clean, clear water where he had swum as a boy, diving for shells and fish. Water that washed away the day's work and left him feeling new. He wondered if he would ever feel clean again. While watching this unfold, consider subscribing to this channel to discover more hidden stories that shaped America's dark past. 3 months into his enslavement, Kwame noticed that some of the enslaved had developed strategies of resistance around hygiene. An older man named Kofi, who had been on the plantation for 5 years, showed him how to wet cloth with morning dew and clean himself in small, hidden ways, behind the quarters before dawn or during trips to the forest to gather firewood. These tiny acts of cleanliness were dangerous. If caught, the punishment was severe. But they were also necessary, small assertions of humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Maria, the woman who bathed the master's children, sometimes managed to save scraps of soap, tiny slivers that had worn too thin for the family's use. She hid these pieces in her clothing and distributed them among the other enslaved women, who would use them sparingly, washing themselves in the dark when the overseers were not watching. It was a dangerous game. Discovery would mean the whip, possibly worse. But the alternative, surrendering completely to filth and degradation, felt like a different kind of death. Father Antonio began documenting what he witnessed in a leather-bound journal he kept hidden in his quarters. His entries grew increasingly troubled as the weeks passed. He wrote about the medical consequences of enforced filth, the infections, the parasites, the diseases that spread because people could not maintain basic hygiene. He wrote about the psychological impact, how the denial of cleanliness seemed to break something fundamental in the human spirit. And he wrote about the moral contradiction at the heart of the colonial project. How could they claim to be bringing civilization and Christianity to these people while denying them the most basic elements of human dignity? One evening, after Mass, a Portuguese colonist named Ricardo Mendes approached Father Antonio with a bottle of port wine and a philosophical question. "You seem troubled by the treatment of our slaves, Father," Ricardo said, pouring 2 glasses. "But consider this, is cleanliness truly a natural state, or is it a luxury of civilization? These Africans lived in primitive conditions before we brought them here. By forcing them to work, are we not elevating them, teaching them discipline and order?" Father Antonio took the wine, but did not drink. "I have read the accounts of explorers," he said carefully. "Many African societies have sophisticated bathing practices, public baths, ritual cleansing, herbal soaps. The Kingdom of Congo has water systems more advanced than some Portuguese villages. The denial of hygiene here is not natural order, it is imposed," Ricardo laughed. "You mistake their imitation of civilization for the genuine article. A monkey can be taught to wear clothes, Father, but it remains a monkey." The priest set down his glass and left without another word. That night, he wrote in his journal, "We have created a hell in paradise and call it progress." Now, as the dry season gave way to the rains of early 1503, conditions on Dom Pedro's plantation deteriorated. The wet season brought mosquitoes in biblical swarms, and with them, waves of malaria that swept through the slave quarters. The disease hit hardest among those whose bodies were already weakened by malnutrition, exhaustion, and the constant assault of poor hygiene. Kwame watched as Adisa, the woman who had been whipped for washing in the river, fell ill with fever. Her body shook with chills despite the tropical heat. She vomited repeatedly, unable to keep down the thin gruel that constituted their evening meal. Without access to clean water to wash herself or her clothing, she lay in her own waste, too weak to move. The other enslaved people tried to help, sharing what little water they had, but it was never enough. Tomas, the overseer, showed no sympathy. When production in the fields slowed because workers were falling ill, he responded with increased violence. The whip became a daily presence, its crack echoing across the plantation like thunder. Those too sick to work were given reduced rations on the theory that food was wasted on the unproductive. It was a death spiral. Illness led to weakness, weakness to punishment and starvation, which led to more illness. Dom Pedro, watching his labor force deteriorate, finally summoned a physician from Salvador. Dr. Manuel Coelho arrived on horseback, a rotund man with a gray beard and an air of self-importance. He examined several of the sick enslaved people, wrinkling his nose at the smell of the quarters, and delivered his diagnosis with absolute certainty. "The problem is miasma," Dr. Coelho announced, using the prevailing medical theory of the time. "Bad air from the swamps and forest. The Negro constitution is more susceptible to these vapors than the European. My recommendation is to burn sulfur in the quarters twice daily and administer purgatives to flush the corrupted humors from their bodies." Father Antonio, who had accompanied the doctor on his rounds, ventured a different suggestion. "Doctor, I have observed that the spread of illness seems to correlate with the lack of access to clean water and facilities for washing. Perhaps if—" "Father, with respect, you are not a man of medicine," Dr. Coelho interrupted. "The Africans' natural odor and uncleanliness are symptoms of their degraded state, not causes of illness. Forcing them to bathe excessively would disrupt their natural constitution and likely worsen their condition." The sulfur was burned, purgatives were administered, harsh concoctions that induced violent diarrhea and vomiting, further weakening already sick bodies. More people died. Adisa lasted 3 more weeks before her body simply gave out. Kwame helped carry her corpse to the burial ground, a plot of cleared forest where enslaved people were interred in shallow graves, marked only by crude wooden crosses. But something shifted in Kwame after Adisa's death. The grief and rage that had been building since his capture found a focus. If they would not grant dignity in life, he would fight for it, however he could. He began to organize. It started small. Late at night, after the overseers had retired to their own quarters, Kwame would gather a small group: Kofi, Maria, a young man named Jabari, and a few others who had shown themselves trustworthy. They spoke in whispers, sharing information about the rhythms of the plantation, the movements of the guards, the weaknesses in the surveillance system. The first act of organized resistance centered on water. There was a stream that ran through the forest at the plantation's eastern boundary, about a mile from the slave quarters. It was rarely monitored because the overseers assumed the enslaved were too exhausted after work to venture that far. Kwame proposed that small groups begin sneaking out after dark to wash themselves in this stream. "They will beat us if we are caught," Maria warned. "They beat us anyway," Jabari replied. "At least this way we die clean." The first expedition involved 4 people: Kwame, Kofi, Maria, and another woman named Ayo. They waited until well after midnight, when even the most vigilant guards had dozed off and slipped through the forest. The moon was nearly full, providing just enough light to navigate by. The sounds of the jungle surrounded them: insects, nightbirds, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. When they reached the stream, Kwame felt something close to joy for the first time in months. The water was cool and clear, flowing over smooth stones worn down by centuries of current. He removed his ragged clothes and waded in up to his waist. Using handfuls of sand from the stream bed, he scrubbed his skin, watching months of accumulated grime and sweat dissolve into the current. The simple act of becoming clean felt revolutionary, a reclamation of the self that slavery had tried to erase. Maria washed her hair, working her fingers through thick braids that had not been properly cleaned since the ship. Ayo scrubbed her arms and legs with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if she could wash away the trauma along with the dirt. Kofi stood in the shallows, water streaming down his scarred back, his eyes closed in something like prayer. They stayed for perhaps 20 minutes, fearful of being discovered, but unwilling to rush this stolen moment of dignity. When they returned to the quarters, they hid their damp clothes beneath dry ones and lay on their mats with their hearts pounding, waiting for the alarm that never came. The expedition was repeated twice more over the following weeks, with different groups making the dangerous journey to the stream. Word spread through the quarters in careful whispers. The night washing became a form of resistance, a secret assertion that their bodies were their own, even if only for brief moments, stolen from their captors' watchful eyes. But secrecy in such a closed environment was nearly impossible to maintain. In early April, Tomas the overseer noticed that several of the enslaved seemed less afflicted by skin diseases than others. Their hair looked cleaner, their skin less raw. His suspicions aroused, he began paying closer attention to movements at night. On a humid evening, when storm clouds obscured the moon, Tomas followed a group of 6 enslaved people as they crept toward the forest. He allowed them to reach the stream and begin washing before emerging from the tree line with 2 other Portuguese guards, all carrying muskets. "So, this is how you spend your rest time," Tomas said, his voice carrying a tone of satisfaction. "Sneaking away like thieves." "Did you think we wouldn't notice?" The enslaved people froze in the water, terror evident on their faces. Kwame was among them. He stood slowly, water dripping from his body, and met Tomas's gaze with a defiance that surprised even himself. "We are washing ourselves," Kwame said in the broken Portuguese he had learned. "This is not theft. This is being human." Tomas's face twisted with rage. "You are property. Property does not decide when to wash. Property waits for permission." As the enslaved were marched back to the plantation at gunpoint, consider liking this video and following our channel for more stories that reveal the hidden struggles for dignity throughout history. The punishment was public and brutal. Dom Pedro had all the enslaved people gathered in the central yard the following morning. The 6 who had been caught at the stream were tied to posts. Tomas administered 20 lashes to each with a braided leather whip that left permanent scars. Kwame gritted his teeth and refused to scream, though the pain was unlike anything he had experienced. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, on the forest beyond the fields, imagining the stream still flowing in the darkness, clean and indifferent to human cruelty. After the whipping, Dom Pedro addressed the assembled enslaved people. "Let this be a lesson," he said from the veranda of his house, his wife and children watching from the doorway. "You are here to work, not to wander. Your bodies are not your own. They belong to me to do with as I see fit. Any slave caught bathing without permission will receive double this punishment." But the punishment had an unintended effect. Rather than crushing the spirit of resistance, it revealed to everyone how desperately the masters feared even this small assertion of autonomy. If washing was so dangerous that it required public torture to suppress, then it must represent something powerful. Father Antonio, who had witnessed the whipping with growing horror, sought out Dom Pedro that evening. "This is barbarism," the priest said, his voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "These people only wanted to wash themselves. How can you call this Christian?" Dom Pedro poured himself wine and sat heavily in his chair. "You still do not understand, Father. This is not about cleanliness, it is about control. If we allow them to make decisions about their own bodies, even small ones, we invite rebellion. Today, it is bathing without permission. Tomorrow, it is refusing to work. Next week, it is uprising and murder in our beds. Or perhaps," Father Antonio said quietly, "if we allowed them basic human dignity, they would have no reason to rebel." "Your naivety is charming," Dom Pedro replied, "but dangerous. I suggest you stick to saving souls and leave the management of property to those who understand it." That night, Father Antonio wrote a letter to his bishop in Salvador, detailing the conditions on the plantation and questioning whether the methods of slavery could be reconciled with Christian teaching. The letter was explicit in its descriptions: the denial of hygiene, the spread of disease, the use of torture to enforce degradation. He entrusted the letter to a merchant traveling to the city, not knowing that the merchant was a business partner of Dom Pedro's and would deliver the letter directly to the plantation owner. Dom Pedro read the letter by candlelight, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. The next morning, he informed Father Antonio that his services were no longer required on the plantation. The priest was escorted back to Salvador under armed guard, his journal and letters confiscated and burned. The months following the whipping and Father Antonio's expulsion were the darkest period of Kwame's enslavement. The prohibition on washing was enforced with fanatical vigilance. Guards patrolled at night, making it nearly impossible to sneak away. The rainy season brought more illness, this time an outbreak of dysentery that killed 12 people in 6 weeks. The quarters became a nightmare of human waste and suffering, with no relief and no hope of cleanliness. But resistance, once ignited, is difficult to extinguish completely. It simply finds new forms, adapts to new constraints. If they could not escape to wash, they would find ways to maintain hygiene within the confines of their imprisonment. Maria, who still worked in the main house, began a dangerous game. The soap she had been stealing was no longer enough. She started taking small amounts of clean water from the master's bathing room, just a cup or two at a time, hidden in a hollowed gourd beneath her dress. She would bring this water back to the quarters and share it among a small trusted circle, allowing them to at least wash their faces and hands properly. Kofi discovered that certain leaves from the forest, when crushed and mixed with water, created a substance similar to soap. He taught others to identify these plants during their work in the cane fields, to pocket leaves when the overseers weren't looking. These leaves were then dried, hidden, and used to create makeshift cleaning agents. A woman named Zuri, who had knowledge of herbal medicine from her life before capture, began treating skin infections with poultices made from plants she gathered. She could not cure everything. The conditions were too severe, the lack of basic hygiene too fundamental, but she saved several people from infections that would have killed them. These small acts of care and resistance created a network of solidarity in the quarters. People looked out for each other, shared resources, tended to each other's wounds. It was not enough to overcome the brutal system they were trapped in, but it was enough to preserve something essential, the recognition that they were human beings deserving of dignity and care. In Salvador, Father Antonio had not remained silent. Despite the loss of his journal, he reconstructed his observations from memory and presented them to Bishop Pero Fernandez Sardinia. The bishop, newly arrived from Portugal and still idealistic about his missionary work, was disturbed by the priest's accounts. "You are describing conditions that violate both the law of God and the law of man," Bishop Sardinia said, reviewing Antonio's written testimony. "The Church teaches that even slaves possess immortal souls and must be treated with basic Christian charity." "Then Your Excellency must intervene," Father Antonio urged. "Write to the colonial governor. Establish standards for the treatment of enslaved people, minimum requirements for food, shelter, and yes, hygiene. If we allow this cruelty to continue, we are complicit in grave sin." Bishop Sardinia did write to the governor, though the letter was carefully worded to avoid direct criticism of powerful plantation owners like Dom Pedro. He suggested that permitting enslaved people better access to water and hygiene facilities might improve their health and productivity, thereby serving the economic interests of the colony. It was a pragmatic argument dressed in humanitarian concern, calculated to appeal to greed rather than conscience. The governor, Tomé de Sousa, was a practical man more interested in profit margins than theological debates. But he recognized that the high mortality rate among enslaved people was becoming an economic problem. Ships continued to arrive with new captives, but they died so quickly that it was difficult to maintain a stable workforce. If better treatment increased survival rates, that was worth considering. In the summer of 1503, Governor de Sousa issued a decree establishing minimum standards for the treatment of enslaved people in the Bahia region. Among the provisions was a requirement that plantation owners provide access to water for washing at least once per week, and that quarters be kept in sanitary conditions to prevent the spread of disease. The decree was weakly enforced and widely ignored. Dom Pedro, like many plantation owners, paid it lip service while changing little in practice. He had a water barrel placed in the slave quarters and announced that bathing was permitted on Sunday afternoons, but he did not increase the water supply enough to make this meaningful. 20 or 30 people sharing a single barrel of water for weekly washing was barely better than nothing at all. But even this small concession represented a crack in the system. The decree acknowledged, however reluctantly, that enslaved people had some right to hygiene, that their bodies were not solely instruments of labor to be used and discarded without thought. It was a tiny recognition of humanity in a system built on its denial. Kwame and the others in the quarters received the news with cautious skepticism. They had learned not to trust promises from their captors. When Sunday came and the water barrel appeared, they approached it like a trap that might spring shut at any moment. But the water was real, and Tomás, under orders from Dom Pedro, allowed them to use it without punishment. The Sunday washing became a weekly ritual, insufficient but precious. People took turns with the water, the younger and stronger helping the old and sick. It was never enough. One barrel for dozens of people and only once a week, but it was something. A small space where they could exercise care for themselves and each other. Maria continued her dangerous work of stealing soap and extra water from the main house. She was caught eventually on a Tuesday morning in September, When Donna Isabel discovered a piece of soap missing from the bathing room, Maria was questioned, searched, and the hollowed gourd was found hidden in her quarters. The punishment was swift and severe. 30 lashes that left her back a ruin of torn flesh. She was removed from her position in the main house and sent to work in the fields, considered too untrustworthy for domestic service. But before she was sent away, she managed to whisper to Kwame and the others the locations where she had hidden soap and other supplies, small caches that would continue to serve them after she could no longer steal. As we witness Maria's sacrifice for the dignity of her community, please subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing these powerful stories of resistance and survival that shaped our history. The harvest season of 1503 brought unexpected change. A ship arrived in Salvador carrying a new wave of Jesuit missionaries, among them a young priest named Father Diego Ortiz, who had studied medicine at the University of Salamanca before taking holy orders. Father Diego was assigned to minister to several plantations in the Paraguasu River Valley, including Dom Pedro's. Unlike Father Antonio, who had approached the plantation with moral outrage, Father Diego came with scientific observation and carefully documented arguments. He spent weeks examining the enslaved population, noting the patterns of disease, the survival rates, the correlation between hygiene and health outcomes. He presented his findings to Dom Pedro not as moral condemnation, but as economic calculation. "Señor," Father Diego said, laying out charts and figures on the dining table, "your mortality rate among slaves is 43% in the first 2 years of ownership. This represents a massive loss of capital investment. My research suggests that improved hygiene could reduce this rate by half or more." Dom Pedro, skeptical but intrigued by the economic argument, agreed to a limited experiment. Father Diego was given authority over 20 enslaved people, a control group that would receive enhanced access to water, soap, and time for bathing. Their health and productivity would be compared to the rest of the workforce over 6 months. Kwame was among those selected for this experiment. Father Diego arranged for a separate bathing area to be constructed, a simple structure with a water trough filled daily from the well. The selected enslaved people were permitted to wash themselves every other day, with soap provided by the Jesuits. They were given clean clothes weekly, replacing the rags they had worn continuously for months. The change was transformative. Within 2 weeks, skin infections began to heal. The smell in the quarters improved dramatically. People slept better, complained less of itching and discomfort. When a wave of fever swept through the plantation in October, none of Father Diego's group fell seriously ill, while 5 people from the general population died. The results were compelling enough that Dom Pedro expanded the program, though grudgingly and incompletely. Access to water was increased to 3 times weekly for all enslaved people. More soap was provided, though never enough. The mortality rate declined noticeably over the following months. But Father Diego understood that his experiment had revealed something deeper than economic efficiency. One evening, sitting with Kwame and translating between Portuguese and the fragments of several African languages, he recorded testimony for a report he was preparing for his Jesuit superiors. "Tell me," Father Diego said, "when you were first denied the ability to wash, what did that feel like?" Kwame was quiet for a long moment, searching for words in a language that was not his own. Finally, he said, "Like dying slowly, not the body dying, the inside, the part that knows you are a person. When you cannot clean yourself, when you must live in filth, you start to forget you were once free. The dirt becomes like chains, but chains inside your head." Father Diego wrote this down carefully. Then he asked, "And now when you can wash?" "Now I remember," Kwame said simply. "I remember I am a man. I remember my name, my village, my children. The water cannot bring them back, cannot make me free, but it lets me remember who I was, who I still am underneath all this. These testimonies became part of a larger report that Father Diego submitted to the Jesuit leadership in Salvador and eventually sent back to Rome. The report, titled "On the Spiritual and Physical Condition of African Slaves in Brazil," was one of the first documents to explicitly link hygiene to both health and human dignity in the context of slavery. It argued that the systematic denial of cleanliness was not just medically harmful, but spiritually destructive, reducing human beings created in God's image to a state of degradation that made evangelization nearly impossible. The report had limited immediate impact. The economic forces driving the slave trade were too powerful, the rationalizations too deeply embedded. But it planted seeds that would slowly grow over decades and centuries, contributing to an eventual recognition that enslaved people were human beings with inalienable rights, including the right to basic dignity and hygiene. By the winter of 1504, conditions on Dom Pedro's plantation had improved marginally but measurably. The death rate declined. Productivity increased. The master attributed this to better management techniques, though Father Diego's records clearly showed the correlation with improved hygiene access. Kwame had survived 3 years of enslavement, far longer than many. His body bore the scars of that survival. The brand on his shoulder, the whip marks on his back, the missing tooth from a beating, the permanent damage to his hands from years of cutting cane. But he had also survived spiritually, in part because of those stolen moments of cleanliness, those dangerous assertions of dignity that reminded him he was more than property. He taught the younger enslaved people the techniques of resistance that had helped him endure, how to find water, how to make soap from forest plants, how to care for each other in the darkness. These lessons passed from person to person, generation to generation, becoming part of a hidden curriculum of survival that would sustain enslaved communities for centuries. On Sundays, when they were permitted their inadequate but precious time for washing, Kwame would stand in line with the others, waiting his turn at the water barrel. He would watch Maria, still scarred from her whipping but unbroken, helping an elderly woman clean herself. He would see Kofi teaching a newly arrived captive how to use sand to scrub away grime. He would hear Zuri singing softly while she washed, an old song from her homeland that none of them had heard in years, but somehow all remembered. And in those moments, standing in the Brazilian sun, with water running over his skin, washing away the accumulated dirt and degradation of enslavement, Kwame would close his eyes and remember the ocean. Not the hellish Middle Passage, but the clean, clear water of his childhood. The water that had always been there, waiting to make him clean again. The fight for dignity, he understood, was not won with grand gestures or violent revolution, though those would come in time. It was won in these small daily acts of resistance, in the stolen bath, the hidden soap, the decision to care for your own body, despite a system designed to make you abandon yourself. In the recognition, passed from one enslaved person to another, in whispered words and quiet actions, that you remained human even when treated as property. As the sun set over the plantation, casting long shadows across the cane fields that had consumed so many lives, Kwame dried himself with the rough cloth he had been given. The water was dirty by the time it reached him. Dozens of people had used it before, but it was still water. It was still a bath. It was still an assertion, however small, that his body was his own. And in that assertion, repeated by millions of enslaved people across centuries and continents, lay the seeds of eventual freedom. The recognition that to be human was to deserve cleanliness, dignity, care. That no system, no matter how powerful or deeply entrenched, could ultimately erase that fundamental truth. The story of the forbidden bath was not just a story of suffering, it was a story of resistance. of people who refused to be reduced to the filth imposed upon them, who fought for dignity with soap and water, who maintained their humanity in the face of a system designed to destroy it. Their struggle echoed forward through time, a testament to the unbreakable human need for cleanliness, dignity, and the simple but profound act of being able to wash oneself clean.